You can only explore so many facets of your own personality before you find yourself repeating the same old stories. But at 83, Paul Newman decided to reveal a lifetime of secrets, the famous Hollywood actors he had secretly dated. Could you ever imagine that behind Paul Newman's famously quiet demeanor, his piercing blue eyes, and the impeccable image of America's ideal husband, star, and icon lay a lifetime of unspeakable secrets? Six loves, six men, six distinct chapters of his life that he had never shared with a single soul? Not until the summer of 2008, as he lay dying in his Westport home. In Connecticut, Paul Newman rested on his sickbed, his body ravaged by cancer. Every afternoon, he would quietly ask his nurse to place an old Panasonic tape recorder by his pillow. He wasn't there to dictate a will or to reminisce about his glorious career, but to confess for the first and final time. He was ready to unveil the feelings he had been forced to hide his entire life. So, who exactly were these men? And why did he guard these secrets so closely until he was on the verge of death? We begin with the very first name he uttered, the one and only Marlon Brando. Marlon Brando, a love story submerged in lust and suffering. Their paths first crossed in 1961 at a fundraising gala held at the Beverly Hilton Hotel. As always, Paul arrived with his wife, Joanne Woodward, by his side. He was elegant and impeccably groomed. Brando, on the other hand, arrived late, striding in with a wrinkled shirt, his eyes a mixture of cold amusement. He positioned himself behind Paul for most of the party. "I thought you'd be as boring as the papers say," Brando finally said, breaking the ice. "Turns out you're the only one here who isn't pretending." And Paul, a man who always kept his distance from such flowery compliments, for the first time in a long while, did not object. From there, it was coffee dates in Westwood to late night strolls around Silver Lake and sudden, unannounced flights to Palm Springs. An indefinable bond began to form between them. Paul loved with the sincerity of a man serious about his feelings. But Brando was different. For Brando, everything was a performance, even love. He didn't love like ordinary people, Paul recounted in the August 3rd, 2008 recording. "He pulled me out of my familiar world, then dropped me into rooms filled with people I didn't know, into situations I couldn't comprehend, under gazes I couldn't possibly control." The meetings Brando dragged Paul to were often at discreet villas in Laurel Canyon or short-term rental apartments in Venice Beach, and they always involved directors, journalists, producers, and the vague promise of new films, awards, and greater fame. Initially, Paul believed they were just parties, but he soon realized the truth. He was merely a prop in Brando's elaborate, behind-the-scenes scripts, a world where all eyes were on Marlon, and Paul was just a supporting character, kept around only as long as he was useful for a media push. Worse still, it was Brando himself who leaked information about Paul's private letters, soft, emotional, trusting, handwritten notes to a photojournalist named Mark Weller. Weller was a gossip reporter who fed stories to the Los Angeles Mirror. In 1960, this very newspaper launched a shocking anonymous column called Love Behind the Lens, which told the story of a famous Venice award-winning actor torn between his family life and a secret relationship with a dark-haired film icon. Everyone implicitly understood it was about Paul. Only Paul had no idea that Marlon himself had left the damning envelope at the newsroom's reception desk. Because Brando needed a scandal, he needed to be the center of conversation. He needed the media to dig up old photos, to stir up old stories, all to ensure the name Marlon Brando never left the public's mind. And Paul, the man who had once loved, once trusted, and once kept their secrets, became the price Brando was willing to pay. What made it all the more painful was when Joanne, Paul's devoted wife, accidentally discovered a copy of that letter tucked away on a bookshelf. She said nothing. Instead, she quietly left Paul a small note. "If you need a refuge, I'm still here. But if you need another lie, I'm not the one who can help you." After that, a long, cold winter descended on their Connecticut home. According to his daughter, Paul didn't leave the house for weeks. Nell Newman recalled that it was during this time her father would often wake in the middle of the night, walk out to the back porch, and smoke alone in the biting cold. No one asked. but everyone knew. Near the end of the recording, Paul said, I once thought that if I was patient enough, if I loved him long enough, I could make him change. But Brando never changed. He only knew how to turn every genuine emotion into a tool for his own survival. And won. I let him turn me into that tool, even when I knew I didn't deserve it. Then his voice dropped to a sigh. I loved him in a way no one should ever love anyone. The affair with Brando didn't conclude with a fiery argument or a formal breakup. It simply ended in silence when Paul stopped answering his calls, stopped writing letters, and stopped believing that love could ever change a man like him. But the agony never stopped. But not everyone who entered Paul's life simply hurt him and left. There was another one who arrived not as a lover, but as a violent storm of possession and power. This was someone who would publicly defend him, only to then use that very protection as a means to control his entire life. That person was Steve McQueen. Steve McQueen. When love is a fire that consumes you both. Steve McQueen, that bastard. Paul Newman blurted out the phrase as if compressing a lifetime of rage into those few words. It wasn't just anger over a single word or action, but fury over an entire past that was manipulated, suppressed, and burned in a passionate, yet suffocatingly toxic relationship. They first met backstage at the Photoplay Awards in 1956. By then, Paul was already a settled family man, while Steve was just a young actor honing his reputation in small television roles. But the way Steve looked at Paul, defiant, raw, and possessive, made it impossible for him to turn away. Soon, their brief encounters evolved into clandestine meetings, lasting for hours at the Chateau Marmont. Paul once admitted in the recording, I thought he loved me, but then I realized he just needed someone to prove he could own. Even Newman. When Confidential magazine published rumors in 1962, alleging that Steve McQueen had an unusually intimate relationship with a fellow male actor in New York, Steve reacted immediately. Less than a week later, he was photographed hand in hand with Anne Margaret at the War Lover premiere. At the very same time, Paul was being asked to sign a non-disclosure agreement presented by Steve's own lawyer. You know what happens to people who get exposed, right? Steve whispered as he handed over the paper. You have a family. You have a daughter. Don't let everything fall apart. Just because you're too weak. He didn't just apply pressure. He erased all traces. He used money, lawyers, and his hidden connections within the media. Once Paul accidentally discovered an expense report for over $15,000 transferred by Steve to a Variety editor with instructions to never mention Newman's name in an ongoing investigative piece. But the cruelest blow was yet to come. In 1965, during an interview on The Merv Griffin Show, Steve nonchalantly scoffed when asked about rumors of a man who had supposedly obsessed him. Steve replied, I don't remember his name. Probably just some overzealous fan. You know, the kind who sends love letters, knocks on your door in the middle of the night. A bit creepy, actually. Paul heard those words and he understood completely. Steve hadn't just cleaned up their past, he had burned it to the ground and then thrown the ashes in Paul's face. During a confrontation, backstage at the Towering Inferno in 1973, Paul yelled, Why did you make me look like a lunatic? To the entire world, Steve just smiled, opened a drawer, and tossed a cassette tape onto the table. Just in case, he said, you ever say something you shouldn't. I have evidence to fight back. He had secretly recorded every private conversation, every argument, every declaration of love, every single moment of weakness. All of it was kept by Steve like an arsenal, ready to be deployed the moment Paul stepped out of line. When Steve married Ally McGraw in 1973, Paul said nothing. But a few days later, a gift box arrived at Steve's house. Inside was the torn shirt Steve had worn after a drunken night at Paul's cabin in Vermont. The bloodstains, the smell of alcohol, and the lipstick marks were all still there. It wasn't a gift, it was a final warning. Paul once sobbed into the recorder, he used love like a knife. Every embrace was a cut, but I still couldn't stop myself from going back for more. I still loved him, even knowing he would be the one to kill me if I dared let him take one step closer. And then As if fate refused Paul a moment of peace, the next person to enter his life was his complete opposite. Robert Redford, gentle, warm, and as loving as a sad song. But their story ended in betrayal. Robert Redford, the love that was betrayed before the eyes of millions. Back in 1969, Hollywood was swept up in the craze for cowboy films. With a movie named Time's Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid asterisk, the press hailed it as the most flawless pairing of two men audiences had ever witnessed on screen. Paul Newman was Butch, charismatic, intelligent, and cunning. Robert Redford was Sundance, cool, sharp, and dangerous. But few knew that as those scenes were filmed in Zion National Park, Utah, during late May, something else was quietly unfolding behind the camera. Every time the camera stopped rolling, a love story not written in the script began. At the time, Paul Newman was 44, living in Connecticut with his wife, Joanne Woodward. Robert Redford, only 32, was already married to Lola Van Wagoner and was a father to 3 young children. Both were devoted family men, but between them, a peculiar attraction began to surface, one that had them quietly observing each other. During cast meals, they would secretly wait for the next scene, just for the chance to stand side by side, to brush shoulders, or simply to hold each other's gaze for a few seconds longer than necessary. One weekend night, while the entire crew was staying at a motel in Springdale, Utah, a lighting technician named Dennis Corbin recalled an incident. He claimed to have seen Paul standing on Redford's balcony at midnight, holding a cigarette, his eyes red rimmed. I didn't dare ask, but I saw Robert open the door, pull him inside, and then they were gone. And that wasn't the only time. From 1970 through the early 82nds, these two men led parallel lives. By day, they were legendary co stars. By night, they were lovers hidden in the shadows. But only one of them believed their relationship was real. The other was desperate to conceal it. In a recording from July 14th, 2008, Paul Newman confessed, "We both had wives, children, reputations, but I loved him with the kind of love that defied every category. I kept thinking that if I just stayed silent long enough, if I waited patiently enough, a day would come when he would hold my hand in the light, just as he held it in the dark. But that day never came." In 1976, Paul planned to reveal their truth to a trusted journalist from Time's The New Yorker asterisk, Stephen Klaus, who had conducted a lengthy interview with him the year before. They were set to meet at the Algonquin Hotel in Manhattan, but just hours before the interview, Paul received a chilling phone call from Robert Redford's representative. "If you say one word about this, you will lose everything." That very night, Klaus received an anonymous fax accusing Paul Newman of having mental health issues and abusing prescription medication and alleging he had once shoved a female assistant while intoxicated. The interview was canceled. Just weeks later, for reasons unknown, Paul's career began to stall. Then, a Palm Springs tabloid called the Times Daily Star Times ran a story. A veteran star, it claimed, was being shunned by a former co-star due to signs of violence and emotional instability. Though no names were mentioned, the media implicitly understood who was being targeted. And Robert, the close co-star Paul had championed, remained utterly silent. On a rare occasion at the 1980 BAFTA Awards, a reporter asked, "Do you still keep in touch with Paul?" Robert simply replied with a nonchalant tone, "We made something great together, but everyone has to move on." He then turned away, not waiting for another question. As for Paul, he went home and wrote another entry in his journal, his handwriting trembling. "The one who once called me his light now uses me as a shadow to shield his own image. He didn't just deny me. He shattered the truest part of me, the part I never dared bring into the light without him by my side." That love didn't end with a breakup, but with a deliberate, crushing silence, a silence that lasted until the day his coffin was sealed. One might think Redford was the peak of his pain, but that wasn't so. The next name Paul mentioned belonged to someone who, at just 24 years old, had brought America to its knees, a young, rebellious, and burning soul who was extinguished far too soon. Have you guessed who it is yet? James Dean, his companion in the fateful night in Mexico. For Paul Newman, his love for James Dean wasn't the most scandalous But it was the one that inflicted the deepest pain, a love that began with admiration, grew through a shared soul, and ended in a heartbreak he would carry to his grave. They first met in the spring of 1955 on the cold concrete floors of a Warner Brothers set. Paul, then 30, was the lead in Time's Somebody Up There Likes Me, asterisk, while James, only 24, was a rising star fresh off the success of Time's East of Eden, asterisk. They should have been rivals, but James's first glance at Paul held no competition. It was filled with surprise, followed by a smile that was enough to keep Paul awake for the next 3 nights. They started meeting more frequently, sometimes in the quiet corner of a late-night diner, off Ventura Boulevard, other times on aimless drives in James's new Porsche 550. There were afternoons spent listening to Time's La Boheme, times in a wooden cabin in Ohio, where they both pretended to be actors just rehearsing their lines. In reality, every line was an unspoken declaration of love. James once told Paul on a rainy night, after they had returned from the premiere of Time's Rebel Without a Cause, asterisk, I don't need anyone else to understand me. I just need you to not pretend when you're with me. Paul gave no answer. He simply took the young man's hand and placed it over his own chest, right where his heart was pounding. But life rarely leaves such beautiful things undisturbed. That June, an anonymous paparazzo named Eddie Prescott snapped a picture of the two of them kissing through a car window parked near the Sunset Strip. No newspaper dared to publish the photo directly, but just a few days later, the shadow lovers of the silver screen speculation column in the Times Los Angeles Herald Express asterisk sent a shockwave through Hollywood. No names had to be mentioned. Everyone knew. James was immediately dropped from his promotional contract with Warner Brothers, and Paul was pulled from an upcoming project by director George Stevens. But more frightening than anything was the backlash from within the industry itself. A production executive once sent Paul a direct fax. If you don't want to drown like Montgomery Clift, you'd better teach your wife how to hold your hand in public. The pressure caused James to collapse. He began to avoid Paul completely. Phone calls went unanswered, and letters that were sent received no reply. Paul once drove to James's house in the middle of the night, knocking on the door for hours, but no one answered. There was only a small note tucked into the crack of the door, written in a shaky hand. I don't deserve to live if living in your eyes is wrong. 3 days later, James was hospitalized for an overdose of sleeping pills. Fortunately, he was saved in time, but the press showed no mercy. Some papers, like Times Daily Variety asterisk, simply reported that the young actor was suffering from a severe emotional disorder, while a writer for the Times New York Post Times coldly wrote, James Dean should learn how to be a person before he tries to be an idol. Paul was equally devastated, tormented, and torn between two worlds. On one side was his fame, his career, and his home with Joanne Woodward. On the other was a love dying in despair, and he didn't know how to save James without dragging them both down. That September, James sent Paul one last message. Mexico City, Friday. If you don't come, I'll understand. Paul didn't go. He was in New York preparing for a photo shoot with Times Life Times magazine and Joanne. He held the plane ticket in his hand, had even gone to LaGuardia Airport, but he turned back. He turned back because he was afraid, because he was weak, because he lacked the courage to tear down everything he had built. And then on September 30th, 1955, James Dean died in a car accident in Chalem, California. The news broke on an 8 p.m. CBS radio bulletin. Paul heard it on the radio in the living room of his hotel suite at the plaza. He didn't eat or sleep for the next 3 days. In that summer 2008 recording, Paul recounted the moment. I sat there looking at my own hands. They weren't shaking. Not a single tear fell. There was only one question repeating over and over in my head. Why didn't I get on that plane? If I had just gone that day, would he still be alive? From that day forward, Paul Newman never uttered James Dean's name to anyone. Yet, those closest to him recalled that whenever he was drunk, he would gaze at the ceiling and whisper, I'm so sorry, you deserve to live a brilliant life. And throughout his final years, Paul kept a faded silver handkerchief tucked away in his bedside table drawer. It was the only memento from their last trip to Ohio. Sal Mineo, a young love stifled by prejudice. By then, Paul Newman was a shattered man, maintaining a polite facade for the world. He was still an icon, still America's model husband, but on the inside, he had completely collapsed. After Steve, he was plunged into a deep pit of self loathing. The man who had once loved in secret now saw only deceit, abuse, and manipulation everywhere he turned. In September 1974, Paul sought out a therapist in West Hollywood, privately recommended by Joanne, his ever silent, ever forgiving wife. He didn't say much to the doctor. Just, I'm so tired and I need a place to breathe. And it was there on a gray, ash colored, rainy afternoon that Sal Mineo walked in. Sal had long since faded from the limelight. After Rebel Without a Cause, people had once dubbed him the next James Dean. But it was that very similarity to James that led him to suffer a shared tragedy. Being cast aside by the Hollywood system for being too sensitive, too fragile, too real, and because of the constant whispers about his sexual orientation. Are you in therapy too? Paul asked. Sal nodded, then pointed to his temple. Not to cure a disease, but to cure what people made me believe times was times a disease. They began to walk together after each session. There was no hugging, no kissing. Neither tried to flirt with the other. They were just two lonely men trying to breathe normally. In a world filled with suffocating pressure. Sal once wrote a small note and slipped it into Paul's pocket. It read, "If they call you deformed, then I want to be deformed with you." Their love arrived as gently as a breath. It wasn't rushed like with Steve, nor fierce like with Brando. It was simply that every morning, Paul would find a handwritten note by his door in which Sal had written, "Did you sleep well? I often wonder if you woke up this morning and didn't see me, would you look for me?" Paul once admitted, Sal was the first person I didn't feel I had to hide myself from. When I was with him, I forgot I was Paul Newman. They planned a trip to Venice together for the spring of 1976, where Sal wanted to write a screenplay for them both to star in a story about two men finding each other in a city that was slowly sinking into the sea. But that trip never happened. On the night of February 12th, 1976, Sal was stabbed to death right outside his West Hollywood apartment as he was returning home from a rehearsal for the play P.S. Your Cat is Dead. The perpetrator was an unidentified youth. Police initially ruled it a robbery. But Paul knew it was the fate reserved for someone who dared to live authentically. When he heard the news, Paul was silent for 3 days. He said nothing to anyone, just sat on the rooftop, looking down at the city below. Then, in the recorded segment, his voice trembled. I thought I was healing him, but it was Sal who pulled me out of the abyss. He didn't need anything from me, except for me to dare to be myself. And I never even got to say thank you. Montgomery Clift, The Last Unnameable Love and Pain. I once thought nothing could destroy me, until Joanne stood before me, trembling, holding a letter she had found under her pillow. A handwritten note from Monty. It was written in slanted, blue ink handwriting, signed with both his first and last name. I had never seen eyes so completely shattered. In 1966, while Paul was filming Ombre in Tucson, Arizona, Joanne Woodward flew to the set unannounced, an opened envelope in her hand. There were no reproaches, no tears, only a single sentence. So, this is why you haven't slept for the past 2 years. Montgomery Clift had been sending Paul secret letters after each of their meetings. They weren't romantic letters, but tear-soaked monologues. In one, Monty wrote, I don't need you to choose me. I just need you not to deny that I exist. Joanne had read everything. And the worst part, one of the letters had been discovered by a wardrobe assistant and leaked to reporter Clara Jenkins of the National Enquirer. That November, the press exploded. Headlines screamed, Paul Newman and Monty Clift. The Buried Truth 20th Century Fox immediately sent a letter demanding Paul clarify any extramarital relationships that might affect his commercial image. Joanne moved out of the house just 48 hours later. She left a letter, folded into a square, with a single line. If you choose to live with lies, at least don't drag me down with you. Paul nearly went mad, not because he was exposed, but because he had failed to protect anyone, not Joanne, not Monty, and certainly not himself. A few days later, Monty called from New York. His voice was weary but resolute. I'm sorry, but I can't take this anymore. I don't want to live like a shadow. I don't want to be your secret. Paul begged Monty to fly to Los Angeles. promising he would move, that they could start over, that he would come out if necessary. But Monty refused. Less than a month later, on the night of January 23rd, 1967, he received a call from Monty's close friend, actor Kevin McCarthy. The voice on the other end was choked. Monty's in the hospital. He took a handful of sleeping pills. They saved him, but he doesn't want to talk to anyone anymore. Especially not you. Paul completely collapsed. Within 4 weeks, he had lost his wife, lost his lover, and was besieged by the press. His contract for the film Cool Hand Luke was delayed due to personal reasons, and on top of it all, he was sued by Universal Studios for violating his moral image clause, demanding $1.2 million in compensation, an unimaginable sum at the time. Paul was hospitalized for private treatment at a psychological rehabilitation center in rural Connecticut under an assumed name. His file diagnosed him with severe anxiety disorder, following emotional trauma, nervous exhaustion, and a state of profound self-rejection. No one knew about this. He paid an entire legal and media team to erase all traces. His private therapist, Dr. Orr Richard Hale, later wrote in a leaked diary entry, "He didn't want to live, but he didn't dare to die. It was the most horrifying state I have ever witnessed." Monty didn't wait for him to recover. 9 years later, on a cold February night in 1976, Montgomery Clift was found dead in his West Hollywood apartment from a heart attack, following a phone call that reportedly ended with screaming. "He died," Paul's voice says on the tape, "and I just lived. Lived forever in the moment. I didn't hold his hand. I thought I was strong, but in the end, I was just a coward who knew how to love." The tape stopped there. There was no more. And for that very reason, it became the most haunting fragment of Paul Newman's confession. The man who buried his forbidden loves for half a century, only daring to speak their names, when his own life was measured in weeks. Conclusion: Paul Newman passed away, taking with him the tapes that were never meant to be released. The names, the loves, the wounds, they all remained there, in the shadows of a glamorous but deceitful Hollywood. He once said, "I don't tell this story to be forgiven. I tell it so I won't be forgotten." And now you are the one listening to that final confession. But how much of this story do you believe is true? How much of it is simply the torment of a soul counting down its final breaths? Please let us know what you think in the comments, and don't forget to like the video